Hi everyone, I'm Anya. Welcome back to my channel. So much has been said about the quality of the writing in the Twilight saga, but I feel pretty strongly personally that you can learn something about writing even from books where you might not agree with all the author's choices. So because Midnight Sun came out recently and I am given to understand that that's quite an event, I decided to ask myself, can I learn something about writing from Midnight Sun? Basically, the answer for me was both yes and no, for reasons that I'll get into later. But the gist of it is that I found Midnight Sun really hard to get into, but I still decided to take a look at the same events as told from Bella's perspective in Twilight. And that was where I really found, in the comparison between those two, that was where I really found that I could learn something and notice some interesting things about writing. So if you'd like to hear me talk about that, keep on watching. Now, before I dive in, I do want to offer a bit of a disclaimer, I guess. Before this, I never read Twilight at all, and I don't have any kind of sentiment attached to it. And so if that's you, I am absolutely not here to take away your enjoyment of it. More power to you. I just wanted to look at what I noticed about Twilight as a writer from the perspective of someone who has a lot of thoughts about writing and about fantasy, and to see what my reaction to it would be as somebody who doesn't have any background whatsoever. So that being said, let's dive into it. So first I want to sort of talk about what issues I saw in Midnight Sun and the things that made it, as I mentioned, really difficult for me to get through. Now, I don't want to say that it was just bad. I actually had some really specific reasons for my reaction to it that don't involve just, snobbishness. But I guess I should offer another disclaimer here, which is that I couldn't even finish the book, but these are some things that I was thinking about in the beginning. One big thing for me was the relationship dynamic between Edward and Bella. So take a look at this quote and tell me what's wrong here. "I was a predator, she was my prey. There was nothing else in the whole world but that truth." So maybe Edward changes over the course of the book, but he is biologically a predator who's viewing Bella as something to be hunted. And if he does change, if he's able to go against that instinct, it's changing something fundamental about him. It's not natural. And honestly, if this relationship between a vampire and a human is the sort of allegorical representation of a relationship between a man and a woman, you've got some issues. Another thing that really rubbed me the wrong way was the way that Edward objectifies Bella, calling her specifically the girl even after he knows what her name is. Then one last major thing. Take a look at this quote. "I never expended so much effort to understand someone in all my life, or rather existence." So this guy who's never had a normal, healthy relationship with somebody before, where he has to sort of, read their subtle cues, understand their emotional needs and interests and what drives them and where they're coming from emotionally, who's never had to do all of that work in a normal way, we're expected to believe that he somehow is going to end up with a healthy relationship with Bella. That takes practice, we don't have that skill naturally. It's something that we have to learn, and if Edward has literally never done that before, then I'm not really sure how this relationship is ever going to work out. And there's really nothing that any changes that Edward undergoes in his character and his motivations and his understanding over the course of the book, there's no way that he could change the fundamental fact that he's never had to have a relationship like this before. So the second main area that made this really hard for me to get through was the world building and the backstory and how that's conveyed, or I guess more specifically not conveyed. Now, I know that this book was not written for people like me whose knowledge of Twilight is basically confined to memes about sparkly vampires, but even given that, I was really lost. For example, there's just so little explanation of who various supporting characters are. I really couldn't tell if Jasper and Rosalie and all of those people were Edward's friends, if they were his family members, if they were his, butlers, if they were people who he had turned into vampires. I really had no clue, just based on what was given to me in Midnight Sun. Now, there's another issue that you can see in this quote when he's sort of getting close to Bella for the first time, and he says, "Not that I would find anything worth listening to," meaning in her thoughts, that he assumes that he'll be able to read. So this shows that Edward automatically assumes that her thoughts are going to be worthless, and B, it reflects his opinions of humans in general. And And that brings up a huge question for me, which is, why does he even have to live among humans to begin with? Like, literally, does he just live there to complain? And that gave me a really negative impression of his character, because that fundamental fact, why he still has to live among humans, was not explained at all. And honestly, because he's clearly so rich, he has the resources to live elsewhere, it would seem, or to build himself, you know, a cabin or a commune or whatever he wants in the middle of the woods and not interact with humans. And so it just left me feeling like he was kind of a jerk, honestly. And then finally, not only on a factual level, but also in terms of personalities and motivations, I really didn't have a sense of what these characters were like, what they normally behave like, and what behaviors might be out of the ordinary for them. And so I feel like a lot of events lost their impact on me because none of that was set up. Now, my third major issue was the portrayal of Bella. And I don't just mean Edward's lack of suitability for a relationship with her. I also mean the way that Bella herself is shown, specifically through Edward's eyes. So what do I mean by this? Well, after Bella talks about how she came to live in Forks, Edward notices that she's unhappy. He sort of calls her out on it, and she responds thus. And she said, as if this was not even an aspect to be considered. Unlike most humans, her own needs were far down the list. She was selfless. So Edward interprets this as a huge virtue, this selflessness. It's one of the things that attracts him to her. And he doesn't seem to consider that it's a problem that she doesn't think she deserves to be happy. And that kind of got me thinking, like, isn't that sort of what men want in women? That women will sacrifice their own happiness for others? And so basically, this is creating a really male-centered idea of perfection, or I should say heteronormative male-centered idea of perfection. And related to that, Edward also spends a huge amount of time thinking about how it seems like every single other guy in the school just really can't wait to get with Bella. Which, I mean, if we're thinking of women as commodities, I guess that makes her a really valuable one, but that whole dynamic just was another reason why I found this book so hard to get through. And in fact, it's not just a very gendered portrayal of Bella that comes through Edward's eyes. It also draws really, really heavily on the kind of white womanhood and victimhood that's associated with that's been painted in the Western canon. If you're not familiar with what I'm referring to here, basically there's this whole canon of images that is used to portray white women as delicate and honestly often sexualized creatures in need of protection from men. And it's simultaneously used to vilify and show how monstrous people are, or creatures or monsters are that attack them. So you can think about old movies, for example. You get some really lurid images like these with women, white women, in postures of distress being attacked by these monstrous creatures. And I think even with something like Star Wars, where you've got Leia and Jabba. And what's more, those attackers who are attacking these white women are often racialized. Like, for example, think about how early zombie movies sort of symbolized America's fear of blackness, which was embodied in the zombies who are attacking white women. This is getting a little theoretical, but what does this look like in Midnight Sun? Well, this girl looked more fragile than her new classmates. Her skin was so translucent, it was hard to believe it offered her much defense from the outside world. And in another part, Edward literally uses the phrase vulnerable creature to refer to Bella. And yet, we're still supposed to be rooting for their relationship, even though she's in the role of this helpless victim and he's in the role of a monster. And that got me thinking, like, why is that? And I don't want to say it's just because of problematic gender norms. I think it also has something to do with the way that Edward is painted as the whitest of white men. Like, not only does he literally have no blood because he's a vampire, he also has access to a lot of the privileges that are associated with white manhood, such as education. He's got like 5 million PhDs or something. Wealth, all of these things. So I guess the only conclusion I could come to was that that's what's supposed to redeem him as a suitable partner for Bella. And all of this despite the fact that he literally wants to prey on her. So I think you can get an idea of why this portrayal of Bella, specifically coming through Edward's eyes, made it so difficult for me to read. So now, as I said, after having this really not good experience with Midnight Sun, I decided to go and read the same events but told through Bella's eyes as they were in the first book of Twilight. And I guess I just sort of wondered, like, what about it made this series so popular. And I actually found that I enjoyed Twilight a great deal more, and I also thought that there were some really concrete things that Stephenie Meyer did in relation to these three aspects, these three issues that I was talking about before, that made Twilight much more palatable, much more interesting, much more relatable for me as a reader. And that, of course, got me thinking about how that reflects on writing and what you can do as a writer to avoid some of the issues that crop up in Midnight Sun. So the first, relationship dynamic, I think a big improvement here is because this is told from Bella's point of view instead of Edward's. Now, I'm sure a lot has been said about this and written about this, so I'm not going to harp on it, but there's just a huge improvement in the intrinsic fact that she is a much more sympathetic character because she is not the predator in this relationship. And there's one particular quote that really drove this home for me, which is when she sees the vampires for the first time, and she says, "I felt a surge of pity and relief. Pity because, as beautiful as they were outsiders, clearly not accepted. Relief that I wasn't the only newcomer here, and certainly not the most interesting by any standard." So in other words, Bella feels anxious, she feels isolated, and she gravitates towards Edward because she sees a kindred spirit in him in some way. Now, I'm still not saying that this is the healthiest of relationships, but at least it's understandable. She's new to town. She wants to feel seen. She wants to feel understood, and she thinks that Edward can give her that, and that's what draws her to him. So even though I definitely question her lack of survival instincts, I can at least relate to that feeling and that need, and I think a lot of readers could in terms of being new someplace and sort of latching on to the first person who seems sympathetic. Now, in the second area of world building and characterization, I think, again, a lot of improvements were made here just because of the choice of the point of view character. Because Bella is new in town, she doesn't know anything about the vampires, and so readers get to learn that along with her. So for example, Meyer uses this really classic world building strategy when Bella asks another student about the vampires, and we get a super brief but really helpful description of the fact that they're, two sets of siblings and they live with Dr. Cullen. That's the basic information that I felt like I was missing in Midnight Sun because it was coming from the perspective of an insider, Edward, rather than an outsider who needs to learn all of this. But I don't think that the point of view and the narrator are the only thing that helps establish the world and the characters in Twilight. I think Meyer also does a much better job of using actual events and examples to show characters' personalities. Take as an example the scene at the beginning where Bella's dad gives her the truck. I think we learn a lot about her and her relationship with her dad and her dad as an individual through this scene. So stuff like her dad is awkward, but he's trying. He wants her to be happy. He's actually really pleased that she decided to live with him, but maybe he doesn't really want to admit it or doesn't feel comfortable admitting it. And of course, Bella's really awkward with emotions as well, but she's also trying her best with her dad. You see how we get so much out of this concrete example of her dad giving her the truck and their interactions and her reactions after that event. I think this really drives home the point of how important it is as a writer to be able to show who the characters are and how they conduct themselves. And I think overall it really emphasizes the importance of these really classic strategies for world building. I mean, they're nothing new, but there's a reason why they're sort of the standard advice that writers are given, whether they're constructing an entirely new fantastical world or letting readers learn about a real location. Now, finally, we come to the portrayal of Bella, the last major point of issue that I had with Midnight Sun. I was reading somewhere, I wish I could remember where, but I was reading somewhere that part of the success of Twilight and part of why it's legitimately valuable is that it's a book written by a woman for women and girls, and there's no male gaze, neither through the narrator, nor the author, nor an assumed reader. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that there can't be harmful relationships or really gendered social standards or other issues, but I think it does go a long way towards solving one of the issues that I had. And basically, Edward is an observer by his very nature because of this power that he has to read people's minds. And Bella is the person being observed. And you can see how switching the viewpoint between the two of them from Twilight to Midnight Sun puts the reader in different positions depending on which character's mind they're supposed to get into and which character they're supposed to relate to as the primary point of view character. And if you're in the mind of Edward, you're basically coming from the point of view of this male gaze, this really heavily male gaze. And that, I guess, just didn't sit right for me. Now, on the other hand, from Bella's own internal perspective, she doesn't think of herself, well, at least not nearly as much as Edward, but she doesn't really think of herself as this archetype of victimized white womanhood. Instead, we see her traits in, I think, a more relatable and more interesting way. For example, we see that she's poor, we see that she's clumsy, we see that she's anxious about moving to a new town, a new school. And on top of that, I think we also have a much more personal interest in her story. Like at the beginning, we wonder, why did she decide to give up her life in Phoenix, given that she's so unhappy with her choice? And this is a huge contrast to the reason why Edward is interested in her, which is basically because some part of him thinks that he should have full and complete access to all the thoughts of every person that he comes across. And because there's something about Bella that doesn't allow him to do that, that's why he's interested. He's interested because of a lack of knowledge, not because of something that he's actually noticed or found out about her, which I think is the reason that we as people are usually become interested in others. You know, even if it's a very mysterious figure, there's still going to be a hint of something, a hint of a backstory, a hint of a motivation that piques our interest, and we really don't get that to the same extent with Edward. So in Twilight, Meyer gives us that sort of real personal interest, instead of just focusing on how little Edward knows about her and like how good her blood smells. So overall, in the portrayal of Bella as well, I think having Twilight written from her perspective, told from her perspective, was a big improvement over Midnight Sun. So if there's one thing I would take away from this, I think it would be the importance of choosing the right narrator, the right point of view character or characters as a writer. I've actually been thinking about this a lot for myself because I'm just starting a new project and really pushing myself to choose a point of view that makes sense rather than the one that just comes naturally to me or that I would fall back upon. But to bring it back to Twilight, I think for me, Bella is a much better narrator than Edward. Not better in terms of some subjective judgment of the quality of her voice or something like that, but better in that she lets readers explore the world. She gives a much more compelling and relatable view on her relationship with Edward, and I think a more relatable narrator that readers can see themselves in as well. At least for me, that was the case. But all of this is not to say that Edward's point of view doesn't have value for readers who are already really immersed in this world and want to get sort of the other side of the picture, want to see things that they weren't able to see when they read the story the first time around. I think in that sense, I mean, it seems like Midnight Sun was really written for that purpose. But if we're thinking about audience here, this is a, commercial YA romance. I do think that Bella is the more effective narrator. This really isn't the sort of adult literary where you can go deep and do a deep dive into the perspective of a sexual predator. So overall, I think I actually did learn something from my comparative reading of these, first sections of Midnight Sun and Twilight, and that's the importance of thinking critically about your narrator, both in terms of the goals of your work and your audience. Now, as I reach the end of this video, I'd love to hear from you, Twilight haters, Twilight lovers, people like me who really just came into it without much knowledge at all. What are your opinions on Midnight Sun? Do you think that as writers we can learn anything from it? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified when I post another video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't get mauled by a vampire before I see you again. Bye.